She's outside a locked building at midnight, 4 black cars waiting at the curb. A door opens. Yeo Jin-woo steps out, the man Seoul fears most, unsteady for the first time. She backs away. "I'm done," she says, "being something you decide for." He holds out the key. She doesn't reach for it. He takes half a step toward her, then stops. He stays where he is and lets her decide. For the first time, Yeo Jin-woo cannot control what she chooses. How does a woman who once sat down at the wrong table end up being the one person capable of making him afraid? Before we get there, if you're the kind of person who likes a slow burn that actually earns its ending, stay with me. This one's worth it. 3 months earlier, Alika Bello was 7 minutes late to a restaurant she'd chosen half out of spite, wearing the blazer she saved for closings and not blind dates, muttering under her breath about Zuri and every terrible idea Zuri had ever had. "He's a friend of a friend," Zuri had said. "Successful, quiet, you'll like him." Alika did not believe in blind dates arranged by people who thought quiet was a personality trait, but she'd said yes anyway, mostly to stop Zuri from bringing it up at the next Sunday Jollifan complaints ritual they'd kept going since her first lonely year in Seoul. The restaurant was the kind of expensive that didn't announce itself. Low light, no music loud enough to talk over. A maitre d' who didn't blink when she gave a name he didn't recognize. She scanned the room once and found him immediately. A man alone at a corner table, dark suit, unreadable posture, the particular stillness of someone used to being watched and choosing not to react to it. She crossed the room before she let herself second-guess it. "You must be the mystery man," she said, sliding into the seat across from him without waiting for an invitation. "I'm going to be honest, I almost didn't come. Zuri has a track record." He looked at her for a beat longer than was strictly necessary, and something in his face, not quite a smile, more the ghost of one, settled into place. "Does she?" "She set me up with a man who brought his mother to the second date. Uninvited. So low bar." Alika reached for the menu. "You're allowed to be nervous. I promise I don't bite unless provoked." He didn't correct her. He watched her instead, the way she talked with her hands, the way she'd already decided the wine, the way 3 men near the door had gone very quiet the moment she sat down, and she hadn't noticed at all. Yeo Jin-woo had spent the better part of 15 years learning to read a room in under 4 seconds, who was armed, who was frightened, who wanted something from him. He knew within that same 4 seconds that this woman wanted nothing. She thought he was someone else entirely, and it was the most restful mistake anyone had made around him in years. "You're very well protected for a man who does something in finance," she said, nodding toward the 2 men stationed near the entrance like they were furniture. "Should I be worried? Would it change your order?" "Absolutely not. I already know what I want." She smiled, unbothered, and he found himself wanting to know what she'd say next before she said it. An unfamiliar, faintly dangerous curiosity. They talked for 40 minutes before her actual date walked in, a mild, anxious-looking man in a slightly wrong shade of navy, took one look at the table, went the color of the tablecloth, and left without a word. Alika watched him go, confused, then looked back at the man across from her, who hadn't moved. That was him, wasn't it? Not a question anymore. It was. "And you knew, the whole time?" "I did." "Who are you?" she asked, quieter now. "Yeo Jin-woo." He said it plainly, the way other men said their job title, and watched to see what it would do to her face. She only heard a name, unremarkable to her, attached to a man who had let a stranger tease him for 45 minutes, instead of correcting her. "Well, Yeo Jin-woo," she said, standing, gathering her coat. "You let me make a fool of myself." "You weren't a fool. Quiet, certain. You were the first person in a long time who talked to me like I was just a man at a table." She didn't ask for his number. She didn't apologize for the mix-up. She simply said goodnight and walked out into the Seoul evening, and Jin-woo sat alone a long while after, turning the shape of the hour over in his mind, like a coin he didn't recognize the currency of. He asked Ha-jun to find out who she was before the night was over, not because he suspected her, but because he wanted to know if she existed the way she'd presented herself. The report came back within a day. Alika Bello, 29, Nigerian, an interior designer 3 years into building a firm from nothing, no family wealth behind her, working nights on a bid for a redevelopment contract she had almost no chance of winning. A woman fighting for a foothold in a city that hadn't made room for her, entirely on her own strength. He read the file twice. Then he made a call about a redevelopment project his holding company happened to control. When Alika walked into the boardroom 3 weeks later and saw him at the head of the table, her stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the presentation in her hands. "You're on the review board," she said, flat. "I am. I'm not going to pretend the last time we sat across a table from each other didn't happen, but I need you to understand. I'm not here because of that. I'm here because my work is good." "I know," he said. "That's the only reason you're still in the room." It wasn't flattery. It was the driest, most literal reassurance he could give her, and it was exactly what she needed. She won the first round on merit because he challenged her numbers harder than anyone else's in the room, and she matched him without flinching. Their meetings became something closer to sparring than negotiation, and the boardroom developed its own quiet running joke, that Ms. Bello and Chairman Yeo could not be seated at the same end of a table without the meeting running 20 minutes long. One evening, after she'd stayed late redrawing a floor plan by hand because the printer had failed and the deadline hadn't moved, Jin-woo appeared in the doorway of the site office with 2 paper cups of the cheapest coffee sold from the cart outside, not the espresso he actually drank. "You've never had that in your life," she said, eyeing the cup. "I'm aware. Sit down and try it then. If you're going to keep showing up uninvited, you can suffer with the rest of us." He sat. He drank it. His face did something complicated and controlled, and she laughed so hard she had to put her pencil down, and he found, with some alarm, that he didn't mind being laughed at, as long as it was her doing it. It was such a small thing. A cart coffee, a folding chair, a woman who made him sit on the floor of an unfinished building at 9 at night. He couldn't remember the last time an evening had cost him nothing and given him this much. That was the night he stopped waiting for a reason to see her. The excuses got thinner after that, and neither of them bothered pretending otherwise. He'd appear at the edge of the Insadong night market where she liked to wander after long weeks, claiming he happened to be nearby, though nothing about his usual routes brought him within 2 districts of it. She'd let him buy her hot tuk from a vendor who clearly knew him by sight and clearly found it hilarious that he was standing in a food line at all. "You do understand this isn't a business district," she said, watching him eat with the same controlled precision he brought to everything else. "There's no contract here for you to review. I'm aware of that too. So why are you actually here, Jin-woo?" He considered the question longer than it warranted. "I wanted to see what you do when no one's asking anything of you." "And?" "You buy street food from a man who overcharges you by 1,001 and lets you win the argument about it anyway. That's called being a regular. You should try it sometime. It requires showing your face in the same place more than once, without an entourage." "I showed my face tonight. You brought 2 men who are currently pretending to look at umbrellas." She didn't turn to check. She'd clocked them the moment they arrived, the way she clocked everything, and didn't bother pretending otherwise either. Baby steps. He didn't argue the point. He simply walked beside her through the narrow-lit street for another hour, saying very little, and it was, without his fully realizing it at the time, one of the easiest hours he could remember having in years. He noticed things about her she hadn't meant to show him, that she refused every offer of preferential treatment so pointedly it had to be policy rather than pride, that she carried herself like someone determined not to need anyone, which usually meant someone who badly needed a reason to let herself. She noticed things about him too, that he never sat with his back to a door, that he rarely mentioned family, and when he did, his voice went careful, that once, without her asking, he told her about his father, a single unprompted sentence, offered while they stood at the railing of a half-built rooftop looking at the skyline. He used to say a man who needs no one can't be taken from anyone. I believed him for a long time. He didn't explain further that night. She didn't push. She simply stood beside him, letting the silence hold what the sentence hadn't. It was weeks before she asked him about it directly. They were at his apartment, the city loud and small below the window, and she'd been quiet for a while before she said, "The thing you said about your father, on the rooftop, what happened to make him believe that?" Jin-woo didn't answer immediately. "Not tonight," he said, and she let it go, because she'd learned by then that with him, a closed door wasn't a refusal, it was a request for more time. He came back to it 2 weeks later, unprompted, the way he'd come to do more often around her. "I was 16, he said, not looking at her, turning a glass slowly in his hand. "My father lost his brother, and the man who'd been at his side for 20 years in the same week. Both of them, because someone found out exactly who mattered to him and used it. He didn't cry in front of me. He held my shoulders after the funeral, and told me the lesson was simple. Control what people know about who you love, and you take away their leverage." He set the glass down. "I've run my life on that sentence since I was 16 years old. I didn't know how else to." She didn't tell him it was wrong. She didn't try to fix it. She just reached over and laced her fingers through his, and let him sit in the fact of having said it out loud to someone for what was, she suspected, the first time. They disagreed too, and neither of them pretended otherwise. She told him flatly that his firm's original plan for the redevelopment's ground floor sacrificed community space for profit margins that didn't need protecting, and he told her flatly that idealism didn't keep buildings standing. They argued for the better part of an hour, loudly enough that Ha-jun found a reason to be somewhere else. In the end, he adjusted the plan, not because she'd worn him down, but because her argument was better, and he said so without pretending it had been easy to hear. After a punishing week where a supplier collapsed a deadline and threatened to sink her bid entirely, Alika arrived at the site the next morning to find the problem had simply resolved itself. New materials, new timeline, no invoice with his company's name near it. She found out anyway. "You fixed it," she said, cornering him. "Don't tell me you didn't." "I made a call. Without asking me." "You would have said no." "That's not the point, Jin-woo. The point is, you decided what I needed before I got the chance to decide it myself. That's not help. That's you making my choices for me, because it's easier than trusting me to make them." He didn't have a ready answer, and the silence sat between them, heavier than an argument would have been. She left before he could construct one. She set a boundary the next time they spoke. If he wanted to be part of her life, he didn't get to secretly run interference on it. He had to ask. He had to tell her. Jin-woo, who had built an empire on never explaining himself to anyone, agreed to something that terrified him more than any rival ever had. And for the first time, it felt less like he was dating a dangerous man, and more like they were building a life together. "I don't need you to be harmless," she told him one night, sitting across a small table in his kitchen, the first meal either of them had cooked for the other. "I need you to be honest. There's a difference, and I need you to learn it. That might be harder for me than being harmless." "I know." She covered his hand with hers. "That's why it matters more." It was the closest thing to a vow either of them had made, and for a while, it held. He learned it fastest, oddly, in the place he was least equipped for, her world. Zuri hosted Sunday dinner the way she'd hosted it for 3 years, loud and unbothered and entirely uninterested in who anyone thought Jin-woo was. She put a bowl of jollof in front of him without asking if he liked spice, and watched, arms crossed, as he ate it anyway, jaw tight, sweat gathering at his hairline, refusing on principle to admit defeat in front of an audience. "He's not going to say it's too much," Alika told Zuri, delighted. "Watch. He'd rather die." "I can hear you both," Jin-woo said, reaching, with as much dignity as he could manage, for water. "Good," Zuri said. "So you run half the underground economy of this city, and you can't handle a Sunday stew." "I didn't say I couldn't handle it. Your face is saying it for you." It was, by any measure, an unremarkable evening. Bad television on in the background, an argument about whether jollof or paella deserved the name first, that nobody was equipped to settle, Zuri interrogating him about his intentions, with the bluntness of someone who had appointed herself Alika's permanent line of defense. He answered every question directly, without the practiced evasions he used in every other room he occupied, and by the time he left that night, Zuri walked him to the door and said, not quite warmly, "You're allowed to come back. Bring your own water next time." It was, from Zuri, close to a blessing, and Jin-woo understood it as one. Gwanteo had served the organization for 2 decades under a system his own father had helped Jin-woo's father build. Hierarchy, silence, control passed down like inheritance. He watched Jin-woo laugh at a cart coffee joke he wasn't told the meaning of, watched him check his phone during hours that used to belong entirely to the organization, and filed it away the way he filed everything, as data. He raised it first with Yun, the oldest of the founding lieutenants, a man who'd served Jin-woo's father before Jin-woo was born, and whose opinion still carried weight in rooms Jin-woo rarely had to justify himself in. They spoke over tea, not liquor. Teo was careful about that distinction, careful about everything. "I'm not questioning his judgment," Teo said, which was, of course, precisely what he was doing. "I'm asking what happens to an organization built on the principle that nothing personal is allowed to become a liability, the moment its leader has something personal to lose. Your generation understood that. Mine was taught it. I only wonder whether his was." "He's young," Yun said. "Young men fall in love. It passes or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, who governs the decisions he makes because of it? Who tells him no?" Teo let the question sit. "I served his father for 30 years. I buried men because someone found the one door that wasn't locked. I would hate to see it happen again, simply because no one was willing to name what was standing in the doorway." He never once said Jin-woo was weak. He never once threatened Alika by name. He simply kept naming the doorway, patiently, to men who remembered exactly what had walked through it before, and let their own fear do the rest of the work for him. He believed, entirely sincerely, that he was protecting the organization from precisely the kind of collapse Jin-woo's father had always warned against. He was not lying to himself. That was what made him dangerous. And it was Teo, working those same old channels, who made sure the first cracks in Jin-woo's guarded privacy reached exactly the ears he wanted them to reach. The first sign was small enough that Alika almost dismissed it. A supplier she'd never spoken to referenced a conversation from her private meeting with Jin-woo, one that hadn't left the room. She mentioned it to him, half joking. He didn't laugh. His face went to the stillness she remembered from their very first dinner, and he changed the subject so smoothly she almost missed that he had. Then came the car, a dark sedan parked outside her studio 2 evenings in a row, engine idling, no plates she recognized from the building's usual traffic. The 3rd evening she came home to find her apartment door unlocked. Not broken, not forced, simply unlocked, though she remembered turning the key that morning the way she always did. Nothing was missing, but the framed photograph on her side table, the one of her and Jin-woo laughing at some gallery opening months earlier, had been turned face down. Precisely, deliberately, the way you leave something when you want a person to understand they've been seen without needing to say a word about it. She didn't call him immediately. She sat on the floor of her own living room for a long time first, feeling something she hadn't let herself feel since she'd moved to this city alone at 26, the specific, cold understanding that a stranger had stood exactly where she was sitting now. When she finally told him, Jin-woo went very quiet, and then very fast, and for the first time she watched the version of him she'd only heard stories about take over completely. After that, the shifts came quickly. Unfamiliar security appeared outside her studio without a word of warning. A meeting she'd arranged with him was cancelled with no reschedule offered. Ha-jun's calm face went tighter every time she asked a direct question he clearly wasn't authorized to answer. And Jin-woo himself grew quieter, retreating into the exact controlled distance she remembered from before she'd known there was anything underneath it. The closer the danger got, the harder that old instinct pulled, the belief that if he controlled every variable, nothing could touch her. It was the same instinct his father had named at 16, already making decisions before he'd finished thinking them through. Ha-jun found him alone one night, going through files he should have delegated hours ago. "You're doing the thing again," Ha-jun said, without preamble. "I don't know what you mean." "You do." Ha-jun sat, uninvited, a privilege he rarely used. "I've followed your orders for 11 years without needing a reason. I'm not giving you one now because I'm afraid of you. I'm giving it to you because I'm not. You're planning to move her without telling her. You did the same thing after your father died. Cut everyone out, decided alone, called it protecting the organization. It nearly cost you everything then too. I watched it happen. I'm not going to watch it happen to her without saying something first." Jin-woo didn't answer, but he didn't send Ha-jun away either, which, for a man who rarely acknowledged being wrong, was its own kind of admission, the clearest warning anyone had given him, though he wouldn't recognize it as one until it was already too late. Twice that week he opened his phone to tell her everything, and both times put it down again, telling himself it wasn't the right moment yet. He made the arrangements anyway. A flight, a quiet property outside the country, registered to a shell company Alika recognized only because she'd designed the interiors for a similar one months earlier. Her name, penciled in beside a departure date, in Ha-jun's handwriting, authorized by him. She confronted him with the printout in her hand. "You were going to send me away," she said, "without telling me, again. To keep you safe. By taking away every choice I had. You would have refused, Alika. You would have stood exactly where you're standing now, and told me you weren't going anywhere, and I would have had to watch you say it knowing what I know. And you don't." His voice was tighter than she'd heard it in months. "I didn't have time to negotiate. I had a woman with a car watching her building, and a decision to make before someone made it for both of us. So you made it for me instead." "That's not a defense, Jin-woo. That's the whole problem stated out loud." She set the printout down between them, carefully, like she didn't trust herself to do anything sharper with it. "You promised me honesty instead of control. You lied. I was trying to prevent the worst outcome. You don't get to call it protection just because the cage has a nice view." She held his eyes, and something in her voice cracked, just slightly on the word cage. "I don't need you to guarantee I'll never be afraid. I need you to trust me enough to be afraid. With me, instead of deciding I don't get to know what's frightening in the first place." "I was afraid," he said finally, and it was the truest thing he'd said to her in weeks. "I am afraid." "Then be afraid," she said, "and tell me anyway. That's what trust is." She was at the door now, coat already on. "If you cannot trust me to choose for myself, then you never trusted me at all. You just liked how it felt to be trusted by me." She left. He stood in the empty office a long time afterward and admitted to himself, privately, that he wasn't primarily afraid of Teo, or of whoever wanted to use her against him. He was afraid of surviving all of it and finding her gone regardless. If you've ever had to choose between someone you love and the version of yourself that keeps you both safe, you already know how heavy this next part is. Stay with them a little longer. Alika didn't go home that night. She sat on Zuri's couch until 2 in the morning, and when Zuri finally said, gently, "You know leaving doesn't mean you stopped loving him," Alika just nodded, because she already knew that part. What she didn't know yet was what to do with it. She went back to work the way she always did, because work was the one thing that had never asked her to be smaller than she was. She finished a client presentation with her hands perfectly steady and cried in her car afterward for 11 minutes exactly, because she timed it, because giving grief a boundary was the only way she knew to keep functioning. She reached for her phone to send him something small and stupid, a photo of a chair he'd once called ugly, and she'd once called a masterpiece, and stopped herself 3 times before she finally put the phone face down and left the room entirely. She found his reading glasses in her kitchen drawer a week later and didn't throw them away. She just closed the drawer. She sat with the question herself for several more days, turning it over the way she turned over a floor plan that wasn't working, looking for the actual flaw instead of the obvious one. She didn't regret leaving. Leaving had been right. But somewhere in the middle of one sleepless night, she understood the two things could both be true. That she still loved him, and that love wasn't the thing she'd walked away from. Trust was. And trust, unlike love, could be rebuilt, but only if he was willing to do the rebuilding in the open, where she could see it. So she went to him, not because Zuri told her to, and not because he sent for her. She knocked on his door because she had decided, on her own, that the relationship deserved one final honest conversation before either of them called it finished. Meanwhile, Jin-woo had stopped fighting the threat the way he knew how. He called a meeting of the men who mattered, Yoon among them, Ha-jun at his side, and Tae-oh seated exactly where he always sat, calm as ever, as if he had nothing at all to be careful about. Jin-woo laid the evidence on the table himself, instead of having it delivered secondhand, the leaked meeting details, the timeline of Tae-oh's private conversations with the old guard, the shell company routed through channels only a handful of people had ever touched. "This is a serious accusation to make in this room," Tae-oh said, unmoved, "on the word of a man whose judgment half of you have already questioned." "Then don't take my word for it." Jin-woo didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He slid the file down the table, toward Yoon, toward every man seated there. "Look at the evidence yourselves. Decide for yourselves what it means. I'm not going to tell you what to think about it, and I'm not going to make this decision alone anymore. That's exactly the habit that got us here." It was, Ha-jun would say later, the first time in 11 years he'd watched Jin-woo hand a room the power to disagree with him and simply wait. They did look. And once the pieces sat next to each other in the open, the timeline, the conversations, the pattern Tae-oh had spent months building in careful, deniable fragments, his authority didn't survive being seen whole. Yoon, who had listened to him over tea only weeks earlier, looked at him now with the particular disappointment of a man realizing he'd been quietly used. Tae-oh had built his entire strategy on secrecy and selective truth. Once there was nothing selective left, there was nothing left of him to stand on. He was gone from the organization within the week, and for the first time in years, nobody in that room had to be afraid to say so out loud. Jin-woo told Alika everything when she came. Tae-oh, the leverage, the flight he'd arranged and cancelled and arranged again in a private war with his own worst instincts. He didn't ask her to stay. "I can't promise you a life with no danger in it," he said. "I never could, and I was wrong to pretend otherwise by hiding the danger from you instead. What I can promise is that I will never again decide what you're allowed to know, or where you're allowed to stand. That choice is yours. That's the first time you've ever actually asked me instead of arranging things for me," she said. "I know, I'm late." "You are." A small, unwilling smile. "Don't be late again." She chose to stay, not because she needed protecting, not because his world had finally proven safe, because for the first time, he had finally given her the freedom to choose it all, and she chose him. Months later, Alika stood in the doorway of her own design studio on opening night, watching people move through a space she had built from nothing but her own name. Jin-woo came, as promised, and stood exactly where he said he would, in the background. People in the room still recognized him. His reputation followed him into every space he entered and probably always would. But he didn't use a single ounce of it to make her night easier. He let her have it, entirely, on her own terms, and simply watched her shine. Later they returned to the home they had slowly, unglamorously built together over the months since. His apartment, technically, but hers too now in every way that mattered, in the throw blanket she'd added to his impossibly minimalist couch, in the mismatched mugs, in the quiet that had stopped feeling like isolation and started feeling like peace. He reached into his coat and produced a single key, the same one from that night outside her building, and held it out to her again. Except this time there was nothing withheld in the gesture, no test, no leverage, just an offer. "It's not asking you to belong to anything," he said. "It's just access. To me, if you want it." She took it without hesitation this time, closing her fingers around it. This time, there was no distance left for either of them to close. She sat down across from him at the small table by the window. The same simple configuration as that very first night, a man and a woman on opposite sides of a table, except now she knew exactly who he was, and she was the one choosing to stay. The wrong table had brought them together by accident. The right relationship existed because she kept choosing, freely, to sit there. If you've made it this far, thank you for staying with Alika and Jin-woo's story. If you want more slow burn, emotionally honest stories like this one, subscribe and stay close. There's more coming.